I have learned that the fastest way to steal someone's future is to convince the world that their past never existed. The tires of my pickup truck crunched across the familiar gravel road as the first rays of a warm Texas morning spread across the fields I had known since childhood. The scent of fresh-cut hay drifted through the open window, mixing with the earthy smell that always reminded me of summers spent repairing fences beside my father. Every turn in the road felt like returning to a memory that had patiently waited for me. The old windmill still turned above the pasture. The weathered red barn stood proudly against the bright blue sky. Even the towering oak tree beside the farmhouse looked exactly as I remembered. For a moment, everything felt unchanged. Then I reached the entrance. A black security vehicle was parked directly across the gravel driveway, blocking the only road leading onto my family's land. A uniformed guard stepped forward and raised one hand before I could even roll to a complete stop. His expression was professional, but the words that followed immediately erased any sense of comfort I had felt only seconds earlier. "Sir, you cannot enter this property." I lowered the window, convinced he had mistaken me for someone else. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," I replied calmly. "My name is Ethan Walker. My father owns this farm." The guard glanced down at a clipboard before looking back at me with the same detached expression. "According to the Homeowners Association, you are not authorized to enter through this gate. We have been instructed to deny you access." For several long seconds, I simply stared at him, trying to understand what I had just heard. My family had owned this land decades before the subdivision behind me had ever been built. I had driven through this entrance hundreds of times growing up. I had learned to ride a bicycle on this gravel road. I had watched my father replace the original cedar entrance sign with his own hands after a storm destroyed the first one. Every inch of this place carried a memory, yet somehow a complete stranger was telling me I no longer belonged here. Before I could answer, another vehicle slowly approached from inside the gated entrance. A silver sport utility vehicle stopped beside the security truck, and a woman wearing a navy business blazer stepped out with the confidence of someone completely certain she controlled the situation. She walked toward my truck without hesitation, her posture perfectly composed, her expression calm but unmistakably authoritative. "You must be Ethan Walker," she said. "I am Linda Harper, president of the Homeowners Association." She glanced briefly toward the farm behind the locked gate before returning her attention to me. "This entrance is now under the authority of the association. Until ownership questions are resolved, your access has been suspended." I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the statement sounded impossible. "Ownership questions?" I asked quietly. "My father has lived on that farm for more than 40 years. Linda folded her hands in front of her and answered without raising her voice. "Our records indicate otherwise. The association has maintained this entrance for years, and we have reason to believe your family's access rights are no longer valid." I looked beyond her shoulder toward the familiar gravel road disappearing into the pasture, the farmhouse barely visible beneath the oak trees, and the faded cedar sign my father had carved years ago. Nothing about the land had changed. Only the people standing between me and it had. That was the moment I realized this was not an argument about a gate. Someone had mistaken maintenance for ownership, assumption for fact, and authority for truth. They believed history could simply be replaced because enough time had passed. What they did not know was that my father had spent a lifetime making sure the truth would never depend on anyone's memory. 3 months before I found myself staring at a locked gate that had once welcomed me home, my father called and asked if I could spend the weekend at the farm. His voice sounded steady as always, but there was a seriousness beneath it that I had never learned to ignore. When I arrived that Saturday morning, the familiar smell of cedar, fresh coffee, and cut grass greeted me. Before I even reached the porch, my father was already sitting in his old wooden chair, watching the windmill slowly turn above the pasture while a pair of horses grazed quietly beyond the fence. He smiled as I walked up the steps, but after we exchanged a hug, he did not suggest we start repairing fences or checking the cattle like we normally did. Instead, he disappeared inside the farmhouse and returned carrying a weathered brown leather box with brass corners polished smooth by decades of careful handling. He placed it gently on the porch table between us, as though it contained something far more valuable than money. "I have been meaning to give this to you for years," he said quietly. I looked at the old box with curiosity before lifting the lid. Inside were neatly organized folders tied together with faded cotton ribbon, yellowed survey maps folded with remarkable care, handwritten notes from my grandfather, certified county deeds, easement agreements, property tax receipts, and photographs showing the farm long before a single subdivision existed nearby. Some documents were older than I was. Others carried official county seals that had faded with time but remained perfectly readable. My father reached for one folded survey map and carefully spread it across the table. The paper crackled softly in the morning breeze. "This farm has never just been land," he said. "It is history recorded one page at a time." His finger traced a thin line running from the county road across what was now the neighborhood entrance and directly toward our farmhouse. This access easement was recorded before anyone even imagined building houses around us. People will see fresh pavement and new gates one day and assume those things created ownership. They do not. I listened quietly as he continued explaining every document, every signature, and every survey marker. He knew the location of each boundary almost by memory, describing old fence lines, stone markers, and oak trees that surveyors had used decades earlier. Then he looked directly at me with an expression I had only seen a handful of times in my life. "Promise me something," he said. "If anyone ever questions this. Families' right to this land. Do not argue with opinions. Let the record speak." I nodded without fully understanding why he felt the need to prepare me for a situation that seemed impossible. No one had ever challenged our ownership. The farm had been in our family for generations, and every neighbor we knew understood its history. Still, something about his tone stayed with me. Before leaving that afternoon, I carefully packed every document into protective sleeves and scanned digital copies of each page so nothing could ever be lost to fire, flood, or time. My father watched me finish the last file before smiling with quiet satisfaction. "Good," he said as he closed the leather box. "Memory fades. Records do not. Someday that difference may matter more than either of us expects." At the time, I believed he was simply sharing the wisdom that comes with age. I had no idea those words would become the only reason I could stand calmly in front of a locked gate while strangers confidently insisted that my own family's history no longer existed. The memory of my father's words disappeared as quickly as it had arrived when I found myself once again sitting behind the steering wheel, facing the locked gate that separated me from the farm. The warm Texas breeze still carried the scent of fresh grass across the pasture, but the peaceful morning no longer felt welcoming. Linda Harper remained standing beside the security vehicle with complete confidence, as though there was no possibility that anything she had said could ever be questioned. The uniformed guard stayed near the entrance keypad, watching both of us while keeping the gate securely closed. I rested one hand on the steering wheel and looked past them toward the gravel driveway that curved gently between the old cedar fences before disappearing beneath the oak trees surrounding my father's farmhouse. I knew every foot of that road. I had driven tractors there before I was old enough to hold a driver's license. I had watched my grandfather repair drainage ditches beside it after heavy spring storms. Seeing someone else claim authority over it felt almost unreal. Linda broke the silence first. "Mr. Walker," she said politely, "I understand this may be frustrating, but the association has maintained this entrance for years. Our records indicate that access through this gate is under our control until ownership questions are resolved." I nodded slowly instead of arguing. "Maintaining a road and owning a road are not always the same thing," I replied. She smiled politely, although there was unmistakable certainty in her expression. "That may be your opinion," she answered. "Our legal committee believes otherwise." The words reminded me immediately of my father's advice. Do not argue with opinions. Let the record speak. I reached into the passenger seat, picked up my phone, and opened my contacts. Linda watched silently while the security guard exchanged a brief glance with her. I pressed one name without hesitation. Michael Reynolds answered after only 2 rings. "Michael speaking." "It is Ethan," I said calmly. "I am standing at the entrance to my father's farm, and apparently the Homeowners Association believes they have the authority to keep me off our property." There was a brief pause before he responded. "Do not leave. I already know exactly which file cabinet contains everything we need. Give me about 45 minutes. "Thank you," I replied before ending the call. Linda folded her arms. "You are certainly welcome to contact an attorney," she said. "We are confident in our position." I simply nodded and leaned against my truck while the morning passed in unusual silence. A few neighborhood residents slowed their vehicles as they drove through the entrance, glancing curiously toward the unexpected gathering at the gate before continuing toward the subdivision. About 20 minutes later, another vehicle approached from the county road. A marked Sheriff's Department sport utility vehicle pulled onto the gravel shoulder, and Deputy Daniel Brooks stepped out wearing a neatly pressed tin uniform and a calm, professional expression. He greeted everyone with the same respectful tone before asking a simple question. "Can someone explain what is happening?" Linda spoke first, describing the disagreement as an unresolved property access issue involving the association's entrance. When she finished, the deputy turned toward me. I explained that my family had owned the farm for decades before the surrounding neighborhood existed, and that my attorney was bringing certified county records to clarify the situation. Deputy Brooks listened carefully without interrupting either of us. Finally, he nodded once and looked toward the locked gate. "Until I have reviewed the documentation from both sides," he said evenly. "I would encourage everyone to remain patient and respectful." I appreciated the way he handled the situation because he did not assume, accuse, or speculate. He simply waited for evidence. As the distant sound of another vehicle echoed along the county road, I recognized the familiar dark blue pickup belonging to Michael Reynolds. The leather box my father had entrusted to me was about to become far more important than anyone standing at that gate could possibly imagine. Michael Reynolds parked beside my truck and stepped out carrying a slim black briefcase in one hand and the weathered leather box my father had entrusted to me in the other. Even from several yards away, his calm expression told me he had no intention of matching confidence with confidence. He intended to answer every assumption with documentation. Deputy Daniel Brooks greeted him with a polite handshake before explaining that both parties had presented different understandings of the property's legal access. Michael nodded once and placed the leather box on the hood of my pickup truck with remarkable care. The familiar brass corners caught the morning sunlight as he slowly lifted the lid. Every folder inside remained exactly as my father had organized it. Neatly labeled county deeds rested beside folded survey maps, recorded easement agreements, certified plats, and decades of official filings preserved inside protective sleeves. Michael removed several documents and arranged them carefully across the truck's hood until they formed a complete timeline rather than a pile of paperwork. "Let us begin with ownership," he said in a calm, professional voice. He handed Deputy Brooks a certified warranty deed recorded decades before the surrounding subdivision had ever been approved. The deputy studied the county seal before comparing the legal description with another document Michael placed beside it. Next came an original survey showing the farm boundaries long before neighborhood streets, decorative entrance walls, or security gates existed. The survey lines extended uninterrupted from the county road to the farmhouse through a clearly marked access corridor. Linda Harper stepped closer, watching quietly as each document appeared. "The association has maintained this entrance for many years," she said. "Surely that must count for something." Michael acknowledged her statement with a respectful nod. "Maintenance certainly demonstrates responsibility," he replied evenly. "Ownership, however, is established through recorded legal instruments, not by mowing grass, repairing pavement, or replacing signs." His tone never became argumentative. It simply remained anchored to facts. He then unfolded another large document that immediately drew everyone's attention. It was the original recorded easement agreement referenced by my father months earlier. The paper had yellowed with age, but every signature remained perfectly legible beneath the official county recording stamp. Michael pointed to the legal description while Deputy Brooks followed each line carefully with his finger. "This easement permanently grants access from the public county road directly to the Walker property," Michael explained. "It was recorded before any subdivision plats were filed. Unless formally vacated through the proper legal process, it continues to exist regardless of later development." Linda frowned slightly as she looked toward the entrance road behind the locked gate. "But the current entrance does not look anything like it did decades ago," she replied. Michael gently smiled. "Physical improvements may change over time. Recorded property rights do not disappear simply because asphalt replaces gravel." He then removed one final item from the leather box, an updated county survey prepared after the neighborhood had been constructed. He placed it directly beside the original survey, so both maps could be compared at the same time. Although one document was many years newer than the other, the same narrow access corridor appeared on both with remarkable consistency. Deputy Brooks leaned closer, carefully comparing property lines, measurements, and survey markers without saying a word. I watched Linda's confident expression begin to soften for the first time since that morning. She was no longer looking at opinions or assumptions. She was looking at decades of public records telling one continuous story. As the breeze gently lifted the corner of the original easement, I remembered my father's quiet voice on the farmhouse porch. He had never asked me to win an argument. He had only asked me to protect the truth, because the truth had already been written long before anyone decided to question it. Deputy Daniel Brooks remained silent for several moments as he compared the original survey with the updated county plat, occasionally shifting one page only a fraction of an inch so every boundary line aligned perfectly. The only sounds around us were the soft rustling of the documents in the breeze, the distant creak of the old windmill on my father's property, and birds calling from the oak trees beyond the locked gate. No one interrupted him. Everyone understood that this was the moment assumptions would either survive or disappear. Finally, the deputy looked up from the maps and pointed toward the paved entrance stretching through the neighborhood. According to these surveys, he said calmly, the current roadway follows the same legal access corridor that existed long before this subdivision was developed. Michael Reynolds nodded but allowed the deputy to continue without interruption. Deputy Brooks traced the line again with his finger until it reached the public county road. The pavement, landscaping, decorative walls, and security gate were all constructed later, but the recorded access easement underneath remained exactly where it has always been. Linda Harper stepped closer and carefully studied both surveys again. I could see she was trying to reconcile what she believed with what the documents clearly showed. Our association has invested thousands of dollars maintaining this entrance, she said after a long pause. We repaired drainage, resurfaced the pavement, installed lighting, and replaced the original gate. Michael answered with the same calm professionalism that had defined the entire morning. And those improvements certainly benefited everyone who uses the entrance, he said. However, maintaining infrastructure does not transfer ownership or eliminate a previously recorded easement. Improvements can exist on top of legal rights without changing those rights. Deputy Brooks slowly nodded in agreement. That is consistent with my understanding as well, he added. Michael then opened another folder from the leather box and removed several county maintenance records along with subdivision planning documents obtained from the county archives. He placed them beside the surveys so the timeline became even clearer. The original farm deed came first. The recorded easement followed. Years later came the subdivision approval. After that appeared permits for road improvements, landscaping, utilities, and eventually the security gate. Every document fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had already been completed decades before anyone standing there had arrived. There was no missing page, no conflicting survey, and no mysterious transfer of ownership hidden anywhere in the record. The sequence itself told the story. Linda quietly read through several pages before letting out a slow breath. Our board believed the entrance became association property because every visible improvement had been paid for by homeowners, she admitted. Michael responded respectfully. That is an understandable assumption if someone only looks at recent history. Property law requires looking at the entire history. Those words stayed with me because they perfectly described what my father had spent years protecting. History was never just memory. It was documentation preserved one careful page at a time. Deputy Brooks closed the final survey folder and looked first at Linda, then at me. Everything I have reviewed indicates that the Walker family retains a legally recorded right of access through this corridor, he said. I have not seen any documentation showing that right was ever terminated or replaced. The confidence that had surrounded the gate all morning quietly dissolved into thoughtful silence. The locked entrance no longer looked like a symbol of authority. It looked like a structure built over a truth that had been patiently waiting beneath it all along. At that moment, I understood exactly why my father had treasured that old leather box more than anything else stored inside the farmhouse. It did not simply preserve papers. It preserved the one thing that could never be rewritten by opinion, time, or appearances, the complete history of our family's place on that land. Deputy Daniel Brooks carefully gathered the surveys into a neat stack before looking toward the closed gate one final time. His voice remained calm and professional, but there was no uncertainty left in it. Based on the certified county records presented today, I have no legal basis to prevent Mr. Walker from using his recorded access easement to reach his family's property. The words settled over the entrance with surprising quiet. Nobody argued. Nobody interrupted. The confidence that had filled the morning had slowly been replaced by the undeniable weight of official documentation. Linda Harper stood motionless for several seconds, her eyes moving from the original survey to the updated plat, and then toward the familiar stretch of pavement leading through the neighborhood. I could almost see her replaying every assumption that had brought us to this moment. Finally, she turned toward the security guard. "Please open the gate," she said softly. The guard nodded without hesitation and walked to the keypad mounted beside the stone entrance column. A soft electronic tone sounded, followed by the steady hum of the gate motor beginning its slow movement. The black steel barrier that had stopped me only an hour earlier gradually slid away, revealing the gravel road stretching toward my father's farmhouse exactly as it had every day of my childhood. I climbed back into my pickup truck, but did not start the engine immediately. Instead, I looked through the windshield at the road disappearing between the weathered cedar fences. The sight was so familiar that it almost felt impossible to believe anyone had ever questioned whether I belonged there. Michael Reynolds closed the leather box with the same careful respect he had shown when opening it. "Your father organized those records exceptionally well," he said with a quiet smile. He understood that good documentation can solve problems before emotions ever need to. I smiled back because those words sounded exactly like something my father would have appreciated. Deputy Brooks returned the certified copies to Michael before speaking to both of us. "I would recommend that everyone involved retain copies of today's documentation," he said. "Clear communication and accurate records usually prevent situations like this from happening again." Linda nodded sincerely. "I believe our board needs to review every property file connected to this entrance," she admitted. "It appears we relied too heavily on maintenance history without fully examining the recorded land records." There was no hostility in her voice anymore, only professionalism mixed with genuine reflection. I respected that. Admitting an honest mistake is never easy, especially when others are watching. I started the truck, shifted into drive, and slowly rolled through the open gate. As the tires left the smooth pavement and settled onto the familiar gravel, the gentle vibration beneath the truck instantly transported me back to childhood mornings spent riding beside my father before sunrise. Every mailbox disappeared behind me one by one until only open pasture remained. The old windmill turned steadily against the bright blue sky, and the weathered cedar sign my father had carved decades earlier came into full view beside the driveway. Its carved letters were faded by countless seasons of sun and rain, but they still proudly read Walker Farm. My father was standing on the porch when I pulled into the yard. He had apparently noticed the vehicles gathered near the entrance long before I reached the house. As I stepped out of the truck, he looked past me toward the distant gate before smiling the same quiet smile I had known my entire life. "I had a feeling you brought the leather box," he said. I laughed softly. "You told me to let the records speak." He nodded once while looking across the fields that had shaped generations of our family. "And did they?" I looked back toward the road that had finally opened without anger, threats, or raised voices. "Every single page did exactly what you always said it would," I answered, realizing that the greatest inheritance my father had ever given me was never the land itself. It was the wisdom to protect truth with patience until truth could speak for itself. The days that followed felt quieter than I expected, almost as though the farm itself had been patiently waiting for everything to return to the way it had always been. Every morning, I joined my father before sunrise with 2 mugs of hot coffee balanced on the railing of the old porch, while the first light slowly painted the fields in shades of gold. The familiar sounds returned one by one. The windmill turned steadily above the pasture. Cattle moved lazily across the dew-covered grass. Meadowlarks filled the cool morning air with songs I had heard since I was a little boy. Nothing on the farm had changed because of what happened at the gate. Yet I appreciated every ordinary moment far more than I ever had before. My father and I spent the following week repairing sections of cedar fence that had weathered through another Texas summer. We replaced loose boards, reinforced old corner posts, and repainted the weathered white rails surrounding the front pasture. As we worked, my father shared stories I had never heard about my grandfather clearing those same fields with equipment far less modern than anything we own today. Every fence post seemed connected to another memory, every oak tree to another chapter of our family's history. Late one afternoon, we walked together toward the entrance where the old cedar sign still welcomed visitors to Walker Farm. Time, rain, and countless summers had faded the carved lettering until it was barely visible. My father ran his hand gently across the rough wood before smiling. "Your grandfather carved every letter with hand tools," he said. "He always believed a family should leave something behind that could not be measured only in dollars." We decided to restore it together. I carefully sanded away years of weather while my father mixed fresh stain that matched the original cedar as closely as possible. When the wood dried, we slowly repainted each carved letter by hand. Watching the name Walker Farm become clear again felt strangely emotional because it represented far more than ownership. It represented continuity. It reminded me that families do not inherit land simply by receiving deeds. They inherit responsibility for preserving the stories attached to every acre. A few neighbors from both the surrounding community and the subdivision stopped by during the week to introduce themselves. Several admitted they had never known the farm existed long before the neighborhood was built. One older resident apologized for believing rumors that the property boundaries had somehow changed over the years. Instead of feeling frustrated, I simply showed him copies of the historic surveys and photographs my father had preserved. He studied them with genuine interest before smiling. "I suppose history looks very different once you actually see it," he said. That sentence stayed with me because it perfectly explained how misunderstandings often grow. Most people are not trying to ignore the truth. They simply never have the opportunity to see the entire picture. Before leaving, several neighbors asked whether they could return in the fall when my father planned to host his annual harvest gathering again after skipping it the previous year. My father immediately agreed, saying the farm had always been meant to bring people together rather than divide them. As the sun settled behind the western pasture that evening, I stood beside the freshly restored cedar sign and looked back toward the entrance road where the gate remained open to everyone with a lawful reason to be there. I realized the greatest victory had never been proving that my family owned the land. The greatest victory was ensuring that the history protecting it would continue long after both my father and I became part of that history ourselves. Autumn arrived with cooler mornings and fields glowing beneath a wide Texas sky. And for the first time in over a year, my father decided it was time to bring back the harvest gathering that had quietly become a tradition for families throughout the area. Pickup trucks began arriving before noon. Children ran across the open pasture chasing one another between rows of hay bales, and neighbors carried homemade pies, fresh vegetables, and slow-cooked barbecue to long wooden tables set beneath the old oak trees. The farm no longer felt like the center of a dispute. It felt like what it had always been meant to be, a place where people shared stories instead of rumors. As I greeted guests, I noticed several residents from the subdivision walking toward the farmhouse. Among them was Linda Harper. She was not dressed in business attire this time. Instead, she wore jeans, a light denim shirt, and a simple smile that looked far more natural than the confident expression she had carried on the morning we first met. She waited patiently until my father and I finished speaking with another family before stepping forward. "Mr. Walker," she said sincerely, "I wanted to thank you both for allowing us to come today." My father shook her hand warmly without hesitation. "Everyone is welcome here," he replied. Linda looked toward the restored cedar sign standing proudly beside the driveway before turning back to us. Our board completed a full review of every property record connected to the entrance after that morning, she explained. We discovered several files had been summarized over the years instead of being reviewed in their original form. That allowed assumptions to slowly replace the actual documents. There was genuine humility in her voice, and I respected that far more than any attempt to defend the past. "We have already updated our procedures," she continued. "Any future property questions involving neighboring landowners will require certified county records before the association takes any action." Michael Reynolds, who had stopped by for the gathering with his family, overheard part of the conversation and smiled. "That will save everyone a great deal of trouble," he said. Linda nodded gratefully. "It already has," We have also begun offering informational meetings for homeowners so they better understand easements, boundary lines, and recorded property rights. Hearing that surprised me because it transformed what could have remained an embarrassing mistake into something that would genuinely benefit the entire community. Throughout the afternoon, people wandered through the farm while my father shared stories about its history. He pointed out the original stone survey marker near the eastern fence, explained how the old windmill had supplied water long before modern utilities arrived, and even displayed copies of the historic survey maps beside framed photographs dating back generations. Children gathered around the large maps with curiosity while their parents asked thoughtful questions about how land records were preserved. Watching those conversations unfold reminded me that knowledge spreads much more effectively through kindness than confrontation. As the sun settled lower across the fields, I stood beside the restored cedar sign and watched families slowly make their way back toward the neighborhood entrance. Cars passed through the same gate that had once stopped me, but now every driver slowed to wave before continuing home. The road had not changed. The gate had not changed. What changed was the understanding shared by everyone using it. The truth that my father had protected inside one weathered leather box was no longer known only by our family. It had become part of the community's history as well, ensuring that future generations would inherit not only accurate records, but a deeper respect for the responsibility that comes with them. Nearly a year has passed since that quiet morning when a locked gate briefly convinced me that paperwork could somehow erase generations of history, and every time I drive down the familiar entrance road, I find myself appreciating the smallest details that I once took for granted. The gravel still crunches beneath my tires exactly as it did when I was a child. The old windmill continues turning above the pasture with the same steady rhythm my grandfather once watched from the porch. The restored cedar sign stands proudly beside the driveway, its carved letters catching the afternoon sunlight as though they have been waiting all these years to be seen again. My father still keeps the weathered leather box inside the farmhouse, but now it rests on a bookshelf instead of hidden away in a closet. Every document remains carefully organized, although we rarely need to open it anymore. The county records have been updated with digital copies. The Homeowners Association has permanently revised its property review procedures, and every new board member receives training on recorded easements before participating in land access decisions. Michael Reynolds occasionally jokes that my father's filing system has probably educated more people than some legal seminars, and judging by everything that has changed throughout the community, I believe he may actually be right. Several months after the harvest gathering, the association invited local property owners, surveyors, and county officials to participate in an educational workshop about property history, boundary records, and responsible neighborhood governance. My father and I attended as guests rather than participants in a dispute, and for the first time I watched neighbors discuss land ownership with curiosity instead of conflict. Linda Harper opened the meeting by acknowledging that good leadership begins with the willingness to verify facts before making decisions. She never tried to hide what had happened. Instead, she explained how relying on assumptions had nearly created a lasting injustice that accurate records prevented. Listening to her speak, I realized that accountability is not measured by never making mistakes. It is measured by what people choose to do after discovering them. As for our family, life settled back into the quiet rhythm we always loved. Spring brought new calves into the pasture. Summer filled the fields with tall grass, swaying beneath endless blue skies. Autumn gathered friends beneath the oak trees once again, and winter reminded us that every season eventually gives way to another if we are patient enough to let time do its work. Sometimes I help my father organize the old documents, even though we both know every page almost by memory. We still unfold the original survey from time to time, tracing the same access corridor that survived changing roads, changing neighborhoods, and changing opinions without ever moving an inch. Every time I see that faded county seal, I remember what my father told me on the farmhouse porch months before any of this happened. Memory fades. Records do not. I understand those words differently now. They were never just advice about protecting land. They were advice about protecting truth itself. Buildings can be remodeled. Gates can be installed or removed. Roads can be widened, repaved, and renamed. Even communities change with each new generation. But when people preserve honesty with patience, humility, and careful stewardship, truth remains standing long after every temporary misunderstanding has disappeared. Whenever I pass through that entrance today, the gate opens without hesitation, not because someone recognizes my face, but because the history beneath that road has finally been recognized for what it always was. My father once told me that land remembers everything, even when people forget. After everything we experienced, I know he was right. Justice was never waiting at the end of an argument. It was waiting quietly inside a weathered leather box, preserved one page at a time until the day the truth finally had the opportunity to speak for itself.